Another cup of tea. Welcome to Varn on Vollmann, where we talk about me and my opinions on William Vollmann. We're still dealing with this book. Actually, not this book. This is the version of the book you can easily find. We're actually dealing with the unabridged version of this book, which is very hard to find, which was published over 20 years ago by McSweeney's press in a limited edition of about 1,000. I haven't found it online for less than $1,000. It's usually way more than that. But I did finally get an electronic copy, and we're going to discuss parts of this book in full. This is Rising Up and Rising Down, Some Thoughts on Violence, Freedom, Urgent Means. We're not going to stop there when my discussion of Vollmann, though, and nor are we going to read the entire of Rising Up and Rising Down's unabridged version, because that would take the better part of a decade to do the way I do these things. But today we're going to be in volume MC, or volume 1, depending on how you classify it, of Rising Up and Rising Down, in a section called Means and Ends. And we're going to be discussing what is meant by means and ends. Let's get straight to it, because there's a lot to discuss here. Let me make this bigger so you can see it. Maybe not that big. Oh, there we go. So if you can get a copy of this book, it is on page 48 of volume MC. 2.0, Means and Ends. And I'm going to read from Vollmann here directly. An end is a goal of or a reason for one's violence. It may be very simple and practical, for instance, the right of the self to defend itself from violence or not, or it may hovers in the sky like a dream of the most religions, close or distant prospects of improvement, revolution, salvation, security, etc. Example: when John Brown's son Watson lay captured and dying, a pro-slavery South Carolinian asked him why he participated in the raid on Harper's Ferry. Duty, sir, said Watson. Ends are just or unjust, but they are only ends. They harm no one until their disciple lists a cudgel of means. Example: Hitler's end can be judged and found wanting according to all rights of self, 5.1.3, 1.1.1-3, 5.1-18, simply stating that it is, quote, the people that I define as Aryans will conquer as much of the world as possible and use it as their living space, unquote. Hitler begins to put this unjust goal into unjust execution, and the Allies declare war. On the other hand, when neo-Nazis march through the streets of Skokie, Illinois, the Civil Liberties Union rightly assists them. A march is only a march. Suppressing speech is always less justifiable than permitting it. Parentheses, Jefferson, the opinions of men are not the object of civil government, nor under its jurisdiction. So many people would disagree with that. No matter, the civil government protects those opinions by applying Turnbull's maxim. A means no one can be sure of in advance because it belongs to praxis, to implementation, to the interaction between strategy and the unpredictable world. After it's an action, a means becomes an act we've judged, a dead body, a revolution, or burned city. Justifications are the links between means and ends. I commit this act for this reasons. A justification may be justified, unjustified, or debatable. Examples: imminent self-defense, if true, is always justified by the right of the self. 2. Defense of homeland is Leonidas' justification at Thermopylae, and also Hitler's in Russia. In the first case, it is justified. In the second, it is unjustified. I would love to know why. I mean, I know why Hitler's in Russia, but why is Leonidas actually justified at Thermopylae? I mean, I think he is, but still. 3, advancing society is one justification for class warfare, which is justified or not depending on one's prepositions. Rising up, a just act of violence. Both means and ends are legitimate. Rising down, an unjust act of violence. Means, ends are both fail to meet the legitimacy standard. An unjust means or an unjust end equally violates all derivative moral actions. Now that's an interesting and daring proposition as a axiom. Any injustice makes all things derived from it unjust. Now, I think that's actually deeper than Vollmann may intend here. But anyway, a just ends may be served by or by a just or unjust means. Either way, the end itself has not been compromised in and of itself. That's interesting. Example, the fact that Trotsky might have shot innocent people for the noblest reasons cannot degrade those reasons from their nobility. But an unjust end poses no just means. And an unjust means deliberately carried out decreases the relevance of any end to the justifiability of the act which involved it, and may nullify even the best ends. Example, no end, no base could justify the Holocaust. I mean, that's a easy argument. Pick a better end there, Vollmann. So we have rising up and rising down here, and we have now the justification series, which Vollmann is trying to work out as if it is calculus. There's a lot of assumptions that we can see here. All right. And there's a lot of standards that are actually very rigorous that we might need to pull apart to really understand what Vollmann is getting at. But let's get back in here. 3. The effects of any revolution, crime, rescue, or war cannot be anything but temporary and local. Therefore, every end remains in its immediate expression temporary and local. All the more reason for its means to be finite and limited. An inconstant end is a warning. Danger of deceitful or outright evil expenditure. B. Precisely because these effects are local, finite, they may well be delayed. They may also cause temporary ill effects in the service of a greater good. Patience is required to determine their success and ultimate justifiability. Just like Aristotle says, count no man happy till they die, count no end just until it is over. At the same time, the moral actors who've caused all the ill effects must stand accountable and offer us proof that the good will indeed outweighed the bad. Why do they have to do that? Vollmann, why? Anyway, example. Churchill writes that the 16.5 million people murdered in Stalin's collectivization drive, a generation would no doubt come to whom more miseries were unknown, but it would be sure of having more to eat and bless Stalin's name. That generation never arrived. Peter L. Berger wrote, I see no possible moral calculus that would retroactively justify the nightmarish 1920s and 1930s in terms of Soviet gross national product of the 1960s. Now, again, we see the Gen X anti-Marxism here, but I actually do think there's a point here. Like, if you're asking people to make collective sacrifices for an abstract that doesn't even happen until the 1960s and then is undone by the 1990s, you do have to judge it on a rather harsh scale because it was so incredibly temporary. Which means the temporary nature of finite ends means that you do have to have a time scale on which you are judging an action. All right, C. Collective justice, or not, sometimes disperses unavoidable individual injustice. The same goes for an attempt at individual justice. Imminence, 5.1.1, imminence, ignorance of actual circumstances, and miscellaneous collective necessities, especially war and revolution, bring about this result. Example, applying deference and retribution to a Turkish atrocity, Lawrence of Arabia refused to take prisoners at Tafas. Whether or not his massacre was in any sense justified, some of the individuals he cut down might have been innocent of the crime he was punishing. 4. One must scrupulously avoid the temptation of desire for results, says Gandhi, referring to nonviolence. Very limited case. Caveat. This is only true for both violence and nonviolence if A, one's attachment to the end is absolute, in which case lack of results is only a disappointment, not a deterrent. Example, one side fights on in a lost war. Antonin de Saint-Exupéry, quote, war is not the acceptance of danger, it is not the acceptance of combat. For the combatant, it is at certain moments pure and simple acceptance of death. And if possible, B, the means harms only those people who stand ready to be harmed. Caveat, authority usually compels its subjects to sacrifice themselves, ready or not. In short, daily life, B, the means harms only those people who stand ready to be harmed, gets violated. Far more often, achieving results or holding the reasonable expectation of achieving them is essential to justify violence. General rule, violence cannot be justified even by the noblest ends should its means be ineffective. So we have a consequentialist thought here. If you fail and you were super violent and killed a lot of people but did not achieve your goal, you cannot say that the ends justified the means because your ends did not come about. Ouch. Dear political theorist, this is a pretty big damnation of most of political violence, since most of it has failed. Example, the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, morally dubious though it was, might have at least been arguably justifiable by imminent self-defense, but without the reason to believe its use would have saved lives by shortening the war. Possible motivations for dropping the bomb. A, to save American or Japanese lives, justifiable. B, to prevent the USSR from entering the war and claiming too great a share of the spoils, unjustifiable. C, to field test the weapon, unjustifiable. D, to overall the USSR, unjustifiable. And probably all those motives are true. In fact, I'm almost certain all those motives are true, having read a lot of political documents from the time. 5, the most illuminating way to perceive the shoddiness of your own ideals is to witness someone else practicing them. And I've lived with this for a long time. When I start seeing things that I believe in lead to people doing stupid things, I start asking myself, is what I believe in right? 6, insofar as a cause is just, it ought to be open to all. Again, that's a big assumption. I'd like to know how you justify that. To the extent that a cause is exclusive, it loses worthiness. I repeat those words in specific sections before the defense of race and gender because the adherents of those causes in particular, which have to do with biological sufficiency and exclusion, sometimes forget that every just end includes all of us. Well, but they don't think that, so that's not going to work for them. All right, 3.0. What factors need to be considered in judging any violent act? Well, you probably should have done this way before now, Vollmann. But anyway, what is the relationship between the aggressor and the victim? The same physical act will have very different meaning if committed in wartime or peacetime, by authority upon a criminal upon a householder, etc. How many victims are involved and how were they selected? Caveat. In evaluating the aggressor and the victim's judgments of another, remember that there is almost never any moral yelliness, any physiognomy of good or evil. 2. See 5.4a and 6.4b. For those of you listening, these are different sections of this massive text. Is the aggressive acting on his own behalf, or is he an agent? Is he acting under compulsion, loyalty, or fear? I'm just going to quit reading those numbered sections. Or is he acting of his own free will? Does he understand the end? Does he control the means? Or is he merely someone else's means? Caveat. When a deed is committed under the aegis of a hierarchy of authority, we who judge must superimpose a corresponding hierarchy of moral responsibility, which the Nuremberg trials explicitly do not do. Sacred and ignorant triggermen are not as culpable as their commanders. I was about to say, this is the opposite of the Nuremberg assumptions. This does not mean that they're not guilty either, but but there isn't a sense that people use Nuremberg to say that everyone is equally guilty in an unjust act, even if they're compelled to do so. This supplement rather than contradicts the principle that we ought to judge each other as individuals, not as members of various categories. 3, The victim has been attacked for no reason at all, for no personal reason, for reasons connected intimately with who he is or what he does or in his capacity as an agent. Is he simply like so many casualties of gangland shootings in the wrong place at the wrong time? Bigger deal in the 1990s. Does the attack occur simply because he appears elderly enough to rob, because she is low enough to rape, or because they are of the wrong color or class? Or is the motive of hatred of this particular individual? Does the victim fly the colors of an enemy state? Reasons to harm as specified persons. 1 through 6, possibly justified, but progressively less likely to be so. 1, what you've done. You physically attacked me. 2, what you are, allegiance. You wear a uniform of an enemy army. 3, what you haven't done. You avenge neutrality towards my behavior when I need your help. 4, whom you associate with. Your best friend is in category 1. 5, what you might do. You could conceivably end up in categories 1, 2, 3, or 4. 6, what you have. You are rich and I am not, so I will rob you and kill you. Note that Vollmann does say that these are possible legitimate justifications. 7 through 8, never justified. What you are, biological, religious, or ideological identity. You are a Jew and I hate Jews. Hence, this formation of Trotsky's, while not proven to be equivalent to Rule 7, is very suspect. It is not only a question of what is being done, but also of who does it. The fact that you exist in any victim will do. These reasons should be located thus to the Lutheran diagram of justice. 2 kinds of justice, 2 kinds of injustice. 1, receive goodness versus 1, received evil. You are what I consider good. You are what I consider evil. 2, active goodness versus active evil. You do what I consider good versus you do what I consider evil. 4, what is the victim's judgment of the act? A victim's consent or even fervent participation, for instance, that of a minor upon a statutory rape is committed, may not necessarily render the act justifiable. Contrariwise, a victim's extreme anguish and condemnation of the act, as the act of a robber who dies in a lawful homicide, may not make the act unjustifiable. However, the victim's circumstances and feelings remain relevant. Cutting off the hands of a thief will be more acceptable in Muslim countries who follow Al-Quran's law, the Shariat, than in Western countries which follow the Geneva Conventions. Talk about an extreme defense of property. 5, what is the victim's judgment of the aggressor's judgment of the victor's judgment and probable response? That's a complicated sentence. The necessity of admitting this seemingly arcane point is borne out by recording the extract from the Babylonian Talmud. What is reason for the permission to kill the burglar? No man controls himself when his money is at stake. Since he, the burglar, knows that he, the owner, will oppose him, he thinks, if he resists me, I shall kill him. Therefore, the Torah says, if a man has come to kill you, anticipate him by killing him. This projection by each antagonist of the other intentions may be extended as relevant. 6, what is the victim's response? Has the aggressor correctly anticipated it? If so, then certain types of violence, such as proactive self-defense, may be justified in this case. 7, what is the aggressor's end? Is it moral? Is it good? Is it justified? It's not. Or if there is no end, the act is unjustified. If so, the act may or may not be justified. 8, what is the aggressor's means? In actual fact, this will be the very first question answered, for it translates as, what is the violent act itself? Does it involve death or harm? Does it involve torture? Is imminent is the victim's right to violent self-defense? 9, what is the aggressor's judgment of his own means? Does he extenuate or justify himself? If not, what does it say about the act? 10, what is the judgment of the aggressor's mean? Do the answers to this question and thus the previous correspond with my own judgment? And if not, why do they differ and whose assessments ought to be followed? 11, is the aggressor's end justified? If not, then acting against it is probably justified. 12, is the aggressor's means justified in relation to the act? Homicide, for instance, may be justified in defense of one's life. It is not justified merely out of loyalty to some authority, although in some circumstances, e.g. war, it may render the loyal defense more justified. Yeah, but why? 13, could the means be unjustified but excusable? No comment on that one. Interesting. 14, What is the aggressor's judgment of the act? If the act is punishable by the victim standard, is it punishable by the aggressor standard also? The answer to this may possibly determine the quality of retribution, judicial or otherwise, which will be called for. 15. What is the context of the act? Whether or not it is immediately justified, does it comprise a part of a larger act? And if so, is that justified or not? To what extent does this war comprise a continuation of the last war? Is the imminent self-defense acceptable in the context of an aggressive act? And 16, how may violence be quantified? What is violence? Does it include householders and corporations insist or eco-defenders deny destruction against property? How severe is it? See the 3 scales immediately following. Scales used in plotting continua and charts. General violence scales. 1. Never acceptable, Gandhi. 2. Wrong as a rule, but not necessarily blameworthy if caused by intolerable provocation, late Martin Luther King. 3. An acceptable last resort, Lincoln, supposedly. 4. Acceptable against aliens, but not against one's own kind, Caesar, Leonidas, maybe. The Bible, actually. 5. An acceptable way of achieving one's ends, John Brown, Cortez, Robespierre, Trotsky, maybe. 6. Generally the most appropriate means, Hitler, Stalin. 7. An end, Assad. Severity of scale for violence inflicted upon the vanquished. 0. Full liberty to surrender. 1. Hostages fine required. 2. Exemplary executions of ringleaders. 3. Mass enslavement, mutilation, or pillage. 4. Mass executions. 5. Extermination. Caveats. 1. The scale represents only acts of physical violence. It cannot represent acts of territorial or political violence, such as Caesar's installation of Cleopatra on the Egyptian throne, or the intimidation tactics of the Amazon Liberation Front. 2. Atrocities committed in combat, even on probable non-combatants, are not represented. That's interesting. That's a huge fucking caveat, William. 3. Proportionality forces to give us a massacre of 30 out of 30 prisoners a higher severity score than a massacre of 500 out of 1,000. 4.0. When is nonviolence unjustified, deficient, or insufficient to achieve its aims? When it is directed against violence and 1. When the sacrifice entailed by the practitioner of nonviolence does not have sufficient intellectual or emotional justification. Example for such a justification from an American anti-nuclear pamphlet, quote, "It is important to remember that we have made a positive choice to act in the way that we see as best and to maintain faith in ourselves, each other, and our nonviolent actions." An example of a lack of such justification: a child tries to be good and passively suffers an adult's unjust violence. Or 2, when the sacrifice is unlikely to limit the violence of the aggressor. Example: Gandhi's absurd advice to the victims of the impending Holocaust, but if the Jewish mind could be prepared for voluntary suffering, even the massacre I've imagined could be turned into a day of thanksgiving and joy that Jehovah wrought deliverance of a race, even at the hands of a tyrant. Which I get why Orwell mocked Gandhi for that, amongst other things. Or 3, when nonviolence will sacrifice people who do not want to be sacrificed, while violence will save them. Example: in the Peloponnesian War, Malayans surrendered at the discretion of the Athenians, who then slaughter all adult males and sell the rest as slaves. 5.0. When is violence justified? Begin by respecting the Machiavellian caveat, quote, "How one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation." I'll clap to that. If we describe rather than prescribe human behavior, justice appears largely irrelevant. Yep, it absolutely does. In fact, you're going to have to convince me that justice is a thing that has a concrete and coherent enough definition for us to actually have the calculus-like caveats you want to strive to it, William. Anyway, most violence will be always unjustified, and we need not expect it to improve it. Worse yet, rights are often unenforceable. I mean, rights often don't exist, my friend. If our means remain insufficient to accomplish our just ends, then what's the use? I actually do think leftists should actually think about this one more often. If our means are insufficient to accomplish our just ends, then what's the use? Tying other people down in a just action that it cannot be won is just sacrificing people who did not sign up for it. I don't know what else to say about that, but you better fucking think about it when you're talking about violence. Still and all, violence is justified in legitimate defense and self-defense. Indications of legitimate defense and self-defense. The violence is more reactive than proactive. Caveat: proactive violence can be justified as self-defense against an imminent threat of aggression so massive or dangerous that a second strike would be futile. Examples: a man aims a gun at me, I shoot him first, and so I live. Example 2: a nuclear regime menaces my country, I lost a massive nuclear strike. The second example is obviously very problematic, and one hopes that the menace has been assessed fairly. I actually think your second example complicates your first example in ways that you're not admitting, particularly writing this right after 9/11, but before the expansion of the war on terror. Nonviolence in this or similar cases already proved ineffective or even proactive. Example, quote, how in the name of common sense do Christians propose to do away with the enormous sin of slavery if not with John Brown's method? Sarah Everett. She was right, at least from the viewpoint of solidarity of the solitary abolitionists and that violently deadlocked epoch of the slavery debate. When the violence is limited, if it will cease if given a concrete result is reached, it shows mercy. Lincoln ends the Civil War when Lee surrenders. I'm going to have to think about that. I'm of the opinion that maybe too much mercy was shown to Southern leadership. Not necessarily enough mercy was shown to all Southern people. But too much mercy was shown to Southern leadership during Reconstruction. Otherwise, the Rutherford B. Hayes Compromise would have not set the country back nearly as much as it did. All right. Back to the next one. Whatever advantage the violence gains is limited to the restoration of a safe status quo, plus conservatively reasonable compensation for injuries suffered. Example, at the end of the Gulf War, that's the 90s Gulf War, not the aughts Gulf War, the U.S. leaves Saddam Hussein in power, but makes Iraq pay reparations to Kuwaitis for having invaded that country. And this is actually 5.1 definition for lonely atoms. I actually quote this indirectly a lot, so you can tell this section is important to me. And I'm going to be wrapping up reading these sections, but I think you do have to get this framework down for what Vollmann is trying to achieve here. Even though I'm going to immediately talk about how this is an impossible framework to do, because you still haven't answered like basic assumptions of like what justice is, where do rights derive from, how do rights derive, when do we cut off violence, how can you know if means are justified if the ends have to be secured ultimately before you can say if the means are justified, etc., etc. Okay, more generally, violence is justified. 1, in legitimate self-defense or defense of other human beings against imminent physical harm. Subpoint, legitimate self-defense means that the provocation and thus the initial threat lie largely on the other side. Subpoint, imminence will be assured by someone who wants to justify violence. It applies to a threat of violence so immediate and dangerous that a reasonable person would agree that a violent defense, resistance, or even proactive violation would be justified. Imminence extenuates many errors of perception and judgment. Example, police officer is justified in shooting a teenager who brandishes a realistic toy gun because the officer wants to verify the weapon's actual capacity. He may well be dead. I think we're going to regret that example quite a bit, William, because that's been used to shoot a whole lot of innocent people on very little evidence. And the reason why is a police officer is actually treated as if he's on a battlefield without proof that the police officer actually is on a battlefield. All right, imminence is a rule on the battlefield and excuses conscripts from killing enemy combatants, even if the war aim is for which they fight is evil. Imminence is often confused with or pretended to be other qualities which may be debatable or outright wrong. For instance, consolidation of legitimate or illegitimate revolutionary authority, the despairing state of John Brown. He really is obsessed with John Brown here. The urgent expedient need for Cortez to complete his wicked conquest. we're not also leaving out more, more like we're talking about, we're trying to form an abstract moral calculus, but we're also sneaking the morality into the calculus itself. That's a no-no, Vollmann. Note, this extraordinary imminence applies to all cases in this book except for the defense of Earth, where scientific imminence may apply. The overlapping contingent category of proactive imminence may be either ordinary or scientific. Obviously, imminent defense of an individual or collective right will always be justified. Strictly speaking, therefore, a justification of imminence as applied to any category in this calculus is redundant. However, I've included imminence occasionally and advisedly when it may not necessarily occur to us in connection with certain categories, or when in essence of an obstinable category. All right. 1A, in legitimate defense of non-human beings against imminent and unjust physical harm. When unjustified has no consensual definition beyond human contact. Beyond the human context. All right, that's interesting. I don't know how it has consensual definition in human context either. Vollmann. All right, 2. In defense of the individual rights of self. To violently defend itself or not, to violently defend another or not, to destroy itself or preserve itself. Suicide is permissible when uncoerced, that is, whenever it is actual suicide, but the most noble as an act of assertion in defense of a right. Example, Caesar's troops beset the city gates, yet Cato has a way of escape. With one single hand, he will open a wide path to freedom. Seneca. 2, to violently destroy another who would be better off dead. If suicide is not wrong, then consensual euthanasia cannot be wrong either. I don't know, man. That's actually not so simple. In extreme circumstances, people may legitimately coerce the death of dependents or incapacitated strangers in order to spare them from suffering. Physical torture, miserable death, abandonment of what would lead to the same. Mental torture, such as permanent dishonor, grief, or defilement, stigma, etc. How does this apply to countries that are convincing impoverished people to voluntarily commit euthanasia? I don't think that's an easy case. Yet, according to this logic, it should be. All right. Example, Lawrence of Arabia shoots his wounded servant, Faraj. We could not leave him where he was to the Turks because he had seen them burn alive our hapless wounded. Such actions ought to never facilitate the advantage of the euthanizer, but can be justified even if should he not wish them applied to himself in a similar case. To violently defend its property or not. Caveats. By proportionality itself, the right to life supersedes the right to property. I don't know that the right to property exists. But anyway, I don't know that any rights are justifiable as absolute like this, actually. But we're going to continue. Others may exercise their right to self-preservation by confiscating excess property as they are in dire need. 2, a householder is not entitled to shoot the fleeing burglar in the back, which is actually a legal term. 2, legitimate authority may confiscate excess property in the interest of the social contracts, taxes, the Muslim zakat, tithe, etc. A circumstantial conditional for 5.1.1 and 5.1.2 to be valid. 1, full self-sovereignty. Example, we shouldn't allow a small child to destroy himself by drinking household poison or carrying a little pistol for self-defense. 2, proportionality must be maintained. The violent response must be equal or lesser force than the injury, making due allowance for ambiguities, mistakes, or passions of urgency. Examples of an allowable mistake: a man shoots and kills a stranger who discovers in process of assaulting someone. He doesn't first inquire if what lethal force the stranger plans to employ. 3, discrimination must be respected. The violent response must be directed against the immediate aggressor, and again, making allowance for imminence. An example of mistake allowed by imminence: a soldier's bullet inadvertently kills a civilian in the field of fire. Caveat: discrimination is obeyed according to one's prepositions. In one early 16th century campaign, the Aztecs liquidated everybody more than 9 years old. 2 years previous, when they'd attacked another kingdom, the criterion for execution was an age of more than 50 because they were the ones responsible for the rebellion. As anthropologists explain, to us, they'd be civilians in their declining years. To their contemporaries, they were respective elders and war leaders. Ideological conditions for 5.1.1 and 5.1.2 to be valid. 1, No attachment to nonviolent creeds. No nonviolence condition. Adherence to nonviolence will prevent us from exercising many of the above rights. But if it's absolute, why does that matter? All right. Example, Tolstoy on the Pact of Mutual Defense between Russia and France. From the Christian point of view, one can never admit the justice of war. 2. No allegiance to collectivity or authority, which might prohibit the self from removing itself from the line of fire. No allegiance conditions. Interpreted by some to include allegiance to an implicit social contract. God, there's so many assumptions in this. Allegiance must prevent us from exercising the right of self-preservation, using euthanasia, etc. Example, Robespierre refuses to save the Girondian deputies from the guillotine. Quote, there are periods in revolution when to live is a crime and when men must know how to yield their heads if demanded. Man, Robespierre's a bitch. All right. Caveat to both 1 and 2. So-called involuntary attachments among the revolutionaries, including prior social contracts, are not binding. Voluntary attachments may likewise be withdrawn at any time. In short, both conditions may be overridden, at which point one returns to an almost to the state of nature. Okay, we're introducing states of nature here. Okay, I'm beginning. This is frustrating. With one exception, the golden rule should always be accepted because the golden rule is always in force, except during emergencies, even if an entire regime should be smashed, an implicit social contract resumes the cessation of violence. Examples. By the rights of the self, one may justifiably refuse to fight a war, or one may renounce nonviolence in order to defend oneself, or one may violently rebel against authority, provided the cause is just, etc., etc. Of course, there may well be dire consequences to the decider. 3, in the defense of self-respect. Right of the self. To violently preserve honor or not. To violently defend its personal authority or not. To violently defend its expression of creed or not. Example, Joan of Arc, my victory or my standard. It was all in our Lord. To violently defend its own particular choice of A, nonviolent behavior, or mutually uncoerced consensual violent behavior, sadomasochism, sexual, ritual, or medical practices. We're not even talking about sadomasochism's complication, all this. The fundamental violent right of self ends here. As a member of society, the self may also take part in exercising the following collective rights. 4, in the construction or maintenance of legitimate institutional authority, man, the assumptions, and dad. This relates to the right to enter into or withdraw from any social contract. 5, the obedience to legitimate authority, provided only that there is an ethical commonality between the giver of the orders and the one who is ordered, and that the indications in one are to apply. The next 2 fundamental rights are not really rights at all, but recapitulations of the principles in this calculus. I apologize for the redundancy, which seems advisable here. They are, in essence, beacons of justifiability for both individual and collective action. 6, when a number of categories of self-defense can be legitimately invoked, e.g., self-defense of race is more likely to be justified if also comprises individual or national self-defense. The more conditions in this section satisfied, the better. A, when a variety of groups or individuals participate in that defense. 7, in defense of proportionality, that is, proportionality means to save from harm a number of people greater than or equal to the number of people who will be harmed by one's violence. See 5.1.2, the right of self to violently defend another, or not. See also 5.2f, proportionality and war aims. A procedural corollary, particular but not exclusively applicable to individuals, where practical, the amount of force employed for justified self-defense should not exceed the amount required for the end, although it may exceed the amount employed by the original aggressor. Example, when Bernard Goetz fires a 5th shot at his assailants after they have stopped being a serious threat, he is unjustified in doing so because he is violating this corollary. Caveat to 7 and 7a, a disproportionate response may be extenuated when imminent self-defense prevents methodological calculation. For example, Goetz was justified in the beginning to shoot when he is threatened with sharpened screwdrivers to the Babylonian Talmud. If a man comes to kill you, anticipate him by killing him. But true knowledge of his intention is impossible, so we have to guess. The last fundamental violent right I posit produces some rather controversial corollaries, so I have invoked it as little as possible in this book. I personally believe in it strongly. This right may be exercised either as individual or collectively. In imminent defense of free speech. Oh, that's going to really piss some millennials off. The self retains the inalienable right to express itself as it chooses or any topic it chooses, the right to empathize with friend or foe, shall we call that treason, to assent or to deny, to offend or to express its conscience, and to express no conscience, to be offensive, vulgar, vicious, or even evil in the object and manner of its expression at any and all times. Artistic expression, political expression, pornography, hate speech, blasphemy, etc. should all be protected. Very American. I happen to agree with most of that. I don't know I would defend it violently, but I mean, I guess defending it in any state context is in some way implicit violence. Direct incitement to violence is an action, not a speech, and may be considered illegitimate to the extent that the violence it excites is illegitimate. And we'll stop here. Now, I just read about 35 minutes of a moral calculus to you with some commentary. But we can already see that there's going to be problems with this because a lot of the terms are not defined in this calculus. And when they are defined, they are sometimes posited absolutely and sometimes posited relativistically or relativistically. There we go. So we have to ask ourselves a few possible questions. Is what Vollmann's doing even possible? Are the axioms of definition of do these signs and signifiers still function at such an abstract level that we still can't make meaning from this set of corollaries and caveats and definitions and flowcharts that he's trying to set up? Now, this reads like pseudo-analytic philosophy, and because it kind of is. But he does actually really embody a lot of logic in these books. I mean, it's a little bit more obvious in this one where he cuts a lot of the boring flow charts out, but also cuts down a lot of the examples. I mean, there are examples in here that go on for pages and pages and pages and are actually quite interesting. We're going to get to some of them. But as we get through this, I both admire this project. This project set my mind on fire, but even when I read it when I was 20 in the abridged form of, like I said, this guy right here, I do not know that I actually think it holds. I'm not even sure this project is something one should be advised to do, but it is interesting how little thought people who invoke violence rhetorically but do not participate in it in their daily life give to thinking this shit through. And at a time where, you know, peons to symbolic violence are everywhere, actual violence is also looming a lot of the time, although it's not everywhere, despite what people may feel. One wishes that there was more thorough discussion of what the act of violence is. So even though I'm finding Vollmann somewhat frustrating here, I still think the project, even if it's doomed, gets you to think about things and the relationship between central assumptions that you haven't thought about before. Most people I know are morally incoherent on the invocation of violence. And when they are morally incoherent, they tend to view violence in almost Carl Smithian terms of just friend enemy, and that's the end of it. That's not sufficient in my mind for pretty much anything. Ironically, I will end this with a call to protect your peace. We'll come back to Vollmann, and I'll give a lot more commentary on the thoughts on self-defense because I have a lot more to say. Take care. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon. You can get access to the Patreon for as little as $4. Blah, blah, blah. Have a